Good evening, everyone. We have had a wonderful day of reviewing housing and urbanism MArC student work, but tonight we get to see something very special, and that is the work of Alex Ely and his practice May. And we're really delighted to have Alex here. Alex is someone who really embodies the ethos of our program, perhaps as much as any architect working in the city today, in that Alex thinks very fluidly across scales. The detail of his work is noticeably beautiful. We often go on walking tours of London to look at the attention to detail of projects, some of which we're going to see today. But perhaps even more importantly, Alex has been a really significant figure in helping us to rethink the role of architecture in encouraging political change around questions of housing, mixed use, and as tonight's title would suggest, spatial systems. So looking at the question beyond simply an architectural project standing on its own, but instead looking at the way in which we might reason across scales and the influence of a project onto its wider surroundings. Alex has few parallels, I think, in London. And the significance then is one in which we're also recognizing that people like Alex become important for their advisory work to government. And Alex has been one of the real leaders in bringing the architectural practice to the attention of government for what it really offers in terms of changing our perspectives about the way in which the city does work, and can work, and perhaps should work in the future. So it's in the attention to both the particular conditions of the area, the site, and the political challenges that are in place, but also the way of influencing change that I think Alex Ely's work is so important to us. So I won't go on, but Alex, I just have to say I'm really delighted that you could give us the time and come and present your work tonight. So please, thank you very much.
Thank you, Lawrence. Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I was sort of struggling to come up with a title that would try and capture some of the broad range of issues that Lawrence has alluded to, the fact that we work from the scale of a city to the scale of the home and the room. And I suppose sort of spatial systems for society was about capturing sort of the underlying forces that shape our thinking at May, both from the scale of a city through to the room. And why systems? Well, cities and neighbourhoods are complex, adaptive systems. Their behaviour is difficult to model and therefore design, often due to the dependencies, the competitions, the relationships, the interactions between their parts. To different degrees, cities and homes are both structured and planned by architects, you, by myself, but also subject to self-organisation, a process that arrives from local interaction between communities, end users, between the different parts, bringing together a disordered system. So my talk's structured around 5 chapters, ranging from the scale of a city as an ecosystem to the cellular structure of the home. And this is Ferrante Imperato's depiction of a cabinet of wonders from 1599. And it represents the humanist interest in empirical exploration aimed at figuring out how everything is connected through nature. Well, in my talk, the links with the natural world will sometimes be explicit, but more often implied. But nonetheless, it gives me a structure for my talk and a way of using metaphor as a way to look at our work through a different lens. So I want to start at the scale of a city. The world population is growing by 83 million each year. It's projected that 68% of the world's population will live in urban areas by 2050. An additional 2.5 billion people by then will be living in cities. It's undoubtedly the century of the city. And I think cities are best placed to deal with some of the challenges we face, particularly around global climate change. And we know that 60% of the built urban area is yet to be built. Do we even have the carbon budget to achieve that? But nonetheless, cities are perhaps one of the best tools to deal with decarbonisation. Carbon footprints increase as distances from cities increase and built form becomes less efficient. So if we're going to tackle some of these problems, then we need to embrace the opportunity that architects and designers can take on in terms of thinking about large-scale placemaking. And through the ages, architects have always been fascinated by the idea of shaping cities. New concepts such as Edinburgh New Towns, the garden cities, ville contemporaine or plan voisin are laid out by architects, visionaries, master planners, often in the image of the estate, promoting a top-down sort of ordered system, segregated functions, rigid urban form. But then when we look at cities like London, like Florence, they're actually more an imprint of the collective behaviour of individuals rather than the work of master planners. Cities, we need to recognise, are living organisms, not machines. They're shaped both simultaneously by top-down forces such as zoning laws, planning commissions, but also bottom-up forces that create distinct neighbourhoods, that create the character responding to an unplanned demographic. And we need to recognise that cities and communities are self-organising. And today, cities need to respond to the challenges that I've mentioned in terms of climate change, demographic shifts, technological revolution, but also social transformation. So by synthesizing both the sort of top-down models of urban theory with a more bottom-up framework of adaptive systems, perhaps we can come up with a sort of 21st century synthesis for the new type of city we want to create. I'm starting with a picture of slime mold. Slime mold are made up of simple units that form networks that exhibit complex responses. They act like smart biological materials, using mechanical interactions to adapt to their environment. Cities have an affinity with slime mold. They possess a kind of emergent intelligence, an ability to store and retrieve information, to recognize and respond to patterns in human behavior. And emergence theory increasingly is teaching us that we can't control everything, despite architects' desire to do so. And we shouldn't try. Instead, let's create frameworks that allow organic growth and adaptation. Zoning can become more flexible, allowing communities to naturally evolve while maintaining their essential character. So the first project I want to mention is one we were commissioned to explore by the National Infrastructure Commission. And it's our proposal called Arcadia. It's an idea for a new city of a population of 250,000 that sits at the intersection between the East-West Rail, between Oxford and Cambridge, so that's this line here, and HS2, which I can't see from this angle, but it's that one there. And an estimated 1.9 million people are expected to move to the region within the next 34 years. At the moment, that growth is being accommodated by suburban sprawl, speculative developers, standard house types being rolled out across this neighbourhood. But there is an urgent need to look at opportunity to create intense, sustainable development. So our proposal is structured as a network of dense, vibrant nodes, each with their own character, connected by an efficient transport system. They morph and evolve depending on the local conditions. So this illustrates a sort of timeline for these nodes to gradually develop as demand takes place, as each node gets occupied and filled. They combine placemaking with infrastructure, creating a network of thriving communities. And over time, like a constellation, each star or settlement has its own momentum and own motion. And then also by linking up with HS2 and other transport networks, Arcadia becomes part of a wider ecosystem that integrates London, Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, forming a dynamic region where knowledge, goods and people flow easily between the urban centres. Success lies not in a rigid plan, but in creating the conditions where a good life can flourish and adapt. It's a city as a living system, growing, changing, maintaining its essential character through time. But underlying it, there is a strength of concept that is about a set of principles. Each node is a dense, walkable neighbourhood that promotes diversity and a connection with nature. The key lies in our understanding of the complex and adaptive system. So like ecosystems, the city thrives on diversity, interconnection, and the ability to evolve. So the model promotes polycentric growth. Each node, illustrated here in the diagram, represents residential as well as mixed-use elements, technological, social, and civic buildings. Each one could adopt a particular program. One might be more geared towards education. One might be more about cultural program. And a network of landscape weaves its way through the nodes, a living landscape that both serves the local community but sustains the ecology and the biodiversity. So each node is a 1 kilometre square zone that forms part of the campus. It's autonomous in its own right, yet it integrates into the broader region. It offers a flexible and scalable model. And each node would house between 5,000, potentially up to 25,000 people. It broadly follows the model of Silchester, the Roman town. Silchester represented an attempt to insert urban features into the countryside, very much different from the Garden City model, which is more about adding countryside into the town. In outline, Silchester was an 8-sided octagon, 100 acres, defended or controlled by a strong stone wall. And internally, the city was divided by a grid of streets, and buildings loosely congregate along those streets, allowing more organic growth. The master planner is in control of the infrastructure and then setting simple rules in terms of the development. As architects, we need to recognize that one of the biggest challenges facing society is both climate change, but also social inequity or inequality. So our job as designers is not just to recognize the spatial systems, but we also need to think about how we design cities and their form and systems of governance. I hope many of you will be aware of Kate Raworth's donut economics. This is an economics theory that recognizes the succinct and just space between that humanity needs to sit between an ecological ceiling and a social foundation. As we grow and consume more resources, there's a danger that we both stretch beyond our environmental capacity, but also increase social inequality. So it challenges us to reappraise our presumptions that growth is good. It reveals, as I mentioned, what happens when we exceed planetary boundaries, but also an important reminder of what happens when we fall below social foundations, i.e. a good access to good housing, good education, and other welfare. Kate Raworth's theory kind of encompasses what we need to live a good life. Although it's an economic model, it directly applies to what we can do as urban planners. It's about promoting access to housing, employment opportunity, food, social equity, good health. So let's just think about the relationship between the donut economics model and what we do and what we can consider and need to address as architects. Just zooming in on some of these, what I've tried to do here is illustrate just a few of the considerations that we need to make when designing kind of urban places, for example. Are we designing them as typically happens with a house builder's model as being monocultural, or as designers, can we promote ideas about diversity, ensuring that there's good social infrastructure, avoiding ghettos, and creating mixed tenure? These are going to have a direct bearing on whether a neighbourhood sits above that social foundation and within that environmental ceiling. When we choose to design buildings, are we designing them to be naturally lit, naturally ventilated, or are we choosing for them to consume resource and energy and fossil fuels? So every decision we make as a designer, as an architect, we need to have at the back of our mind, is this going to help or hinder in terms of our ability to work within these goals? We worked with useful projects on a project that I'm going to come on to, Meridian Water, that borrows from Kate Raworth's donut economics to set a form of metrics and performance measures that our client at Meridian Water could control and manage the future development as the city and the neighbourhood grows. And we developed a set of key performance indicators against each of the Raworth zones within her model. And that allows us to calibrate with the client decisions around affordable housing or viability or access to green space. As one thing goes up in terms of, say, density or housing numbers, that another thing comes down in terms of access to open space because we're using more land. So very clearly, like a graphic equalizer, the client can make decisions about whether what becomes a driver. Is it about economic value, social value, or environmental value? As architects, again, we need to recognize that as well as complementing the sort of spatial systems, we can work with other consultants to think about the broader things that influence city making and place making. And the systems thinking in master plan also needs to think about the temporal dimension, recognizing the opportunity for meanwhile uses that enable a place to grow, considering the phasing, adapting tools that enable and help the client to manage the project over its course of its development. And although master planning sits in the middle as the master of the scheme and the thinking, it's dependent on all these other areas of influence, some of which the architects can input into or control, and others we need other consultants and other specialisms. Moving into the next scale of consideration, I want to look at the neighbourhood. And again, using it here, biodiversity as a metaphor for our holistic thinking, particularly that's needed at this sort of scale, and recognising that neighbourhood is an interconnected system where every element contributes to the whole. So I'm going to expand on the Meridian Water scheme that I just mentioned. This is a neighbourhood in northeast London, Enfield. Our client was the borough, the council, and we worked with a brilliant team, Periscope, who I think you've heard from before, talking about the great work they've been doing with Catherine here in Lewis, Killander and Schreiberg, brilliant Swedish architects, as well as Jacobs bringing the engineering expertise. Interestingly, about the size being 1 kilometre squared, it's similar in size to one of the nodes in our Arcadia project that you've just seen. So it's kind of putting into practice some of those more conceptual thinkings at the city level here at the neighbourhood level. It's the largest regeneration project in the borough, 82 hectares of brownfield retail and industrial land sited within the lower Lee Valley Park. And you really get a sense of the park running through here and continuing, as I'll come on to, through our proposal. So first, the master plan draws on the natural resources that we find in the neighbourhood, responding to the waterways and the green spaces, extending the park, as I say, so that it feels embedded within its wider context. It respects local climate, culture, but also the history, creating that sense of identity and belonging. Integrating the natural features enhances the neighbourhood's character, but also addresses ideas about sustainability. At the heart of the proposal is the idea of a green loop, which gives everyone access to green space on their doorstep, Park life becomes part of the urban consideration, and ecology extends throughout the project and feels very evident and visible throughout the scheme. Public transport supports the high density that's needed to make this project work. There's a high street that extends from the new Meridian Water Station, which connects down to Liverpool Street, and then running out to Edmonton Marshes. It becomes a backbone of the neighbourhood. And then we need to consider how to create a diverse and mixed place with diversity of type, tenure of housing, but also opportunity for employment, business, through to light industry, education, leisure, social infrastructure, all the wider things that make up a good city and make a place livable. Making the area adaptable to social, economic, and environmental challenges, much in the same way that biodiversity ensures that ecosystems are resilient to change. Climate shifts or disease outbreak, when a neighbourhood or when an area has strong biodiversity, that's the sort of resilience it offers to overcome those shifts and those problems. And cities can work in the same way. So a healthy ecosystem maintains the balance between growth and conservation, avoiding overuse of our resources. Here, this is a broadband concept. So in Meridian Water, although it's largely brownfield land, there are some existing light industries. There's a strong area, particularly around here and around the canal, that already has thriving businesses. And the intention of the broadband is to enhance and extend those opportunities and retain the existing buildings. They give the new place a sense of place from the outset. They become something that allow the neighbour to grow around and form a sense of community and a sense of identity. And then we conceive of micro-neighbourhoods. So within the larger neighbourhood, a series of micro-neighbourhoods offer places of local identity, and each one named around either kind of historical characteristics or things that we've learned about and found in the neighbourhood. And each will be determined and defined by, again, a particular urban morphology or local kind of characteristics in terms of uses. But importantly, it's the local streets that give the neighbourhood its life. In nature, just as rivers connect forests and wetlands, allowing species to migrate and thrive, so too do streets provide that connectivity. They make cities walkable, they promote cycling, they help public transport, but also foster connection and movement and interaction, encouraging social cohesion, economic activity, but also the environmental benefits like reduced reliance on cars. So a continuous network of streets very much stands at the root of this neighbourhood, a bit like the mycelium below a forest that connects all the trees, sending messages and food around the forest. It becomes that continuity between the wider place. We can think of the work and theories of Jane Jacobs, who in her book Life and Death of Great American Cities, but also the Economies of Cities, about how important the streets are as part of the vitality of a working city. That the vitality comes from those loose, improvised assemblies of individuals who inhabit the streets. Cities, Jacobs understood, were not created by central planning commissions, but actually by the low-level actions of borderline strangers going about their everyday life and supporting local businesses. So here in the micro-neighbourhoods, that street infrastructure becomes critical. Different components of a community, in this case residential, commercial, educational and recreational, support each other. Local shops thrive where nearby residents and public parks provide that easy access. Just as species within an ecosystem rely on one another in the way that pollinators depend on plants and plants rely on pollinators. Everything becomes a virtuous circle and feedback loop. In other neighbourhoods, like-minded businesses cluster. where there are financial incentives to do. It's what academics call the economies of agglomeration. Clustering becomes a self-perpetuating cycle, bringing consumers and employees together, allowing consumers an easier way of finding the goods and the jobs they're after. Shared information makes the cluster of businesses more competitive than isolated ones. And having varied amenities and services ensures that communities remain functional, even if one element of that infrastructure fails. Redundancy becomes a safeguard. Again, much in the way that a biodiversity in a forest, if one species suffers a certain infection, others will be more resilient. A monocultural forest that's subject to particular invasions will die back. So communities need to offer diverse social groups, be flexible, and have robust planning that can adapt as pollution to address pollution change and climate impact. So here's an illustration of a sort of green spaces that will filter through the neighbourhood, places for play, for creativity, for sport, for leisure. Contrasted with streets that prioritise the pedestrian and support those sort of low-level activities that Jane Jacobs observes and talks about. Here, buildings are flexible such that they can accommodate different household structures in the case of a residential street on the left, or adaptive to different types of businesses and industry on the right. This idea of low-level interactions between strangers is very much illustrated in the beautiful documentary photography of the American photographer Lee Friedlander. His work beautifully captures the street life, the complexity of the American social landscape, capturing urban life with its unflinching realism. And we need to remember that streets and sidewalks are the primary conduit for the flow of information between a city residents. Gary Winogrand likewise captures the energy of the street and its unruly momentum. He was interested in the rhythm of the streets and the people who created it. Thinking when we're designing neighbourhoods, not just about the streets, but that informal network of public spaces, the incidental urban rooms that become spaces to catch up with neighbours, to meet strangers, or relax and just observe the world going by. We need to think, even at a neighbourhood scale, even at a master plan scale, of how we can accommodate these sort of serendipitous moments. Zooming in again to the urban block scale, I've referred to community here, both as a reference to its classification within the ecosystem hierarchy, but also as a reference to local groups of people thriving within a neighbourhood. Urban types are really the quintessence of a city's architecture. These figure ground plans, I'm sure many of you can recognise where they are. They beautifully capture how built form and and types inform the fabric of the city. They range from the structured and planned Cerda grid in Barcelona, a top-down idea of city planning, through to the more responsive Nash plan of London, which nonetheless has to deal with local conditions and found situations, through to the much more organic development of Siena on the right. And at May, we've designed in all these conditions. We've designed terrace housing, we've designed tower blocks, but I want to focus on the medium density urban apartment block that perhaps is characterized by these sort of figure grounds, touching on the common ground between them, the shared DNA, but also their adaptive features. This is a proposal that we developed with DRMMN, with Philip here in the room, who I believe you've heard from in the juries today. It's the Cambridge Road Estate in Kingston, and it presents an urban ensemble of perimeter blocks, common in their sort of DNA structure, but able to adapt to the nuances of the setting, the wider context, but also some of the localized places that we're trying to create, whether that's a sort of green spine running through with spaces that grow and contract and compress to larger places for sport and recreation. Buildings that need to deflect in order to just pick up geometrical or geographical differences, or steps in the form to respond to local conditions. Nonetheless, the infrastructure, the DNA, the infrastructure of the building block remains the same. A simple urban block, perimeter block with a tower on the corner. The towers kind of lend legibility to what is otherwise a sort of fairly consistently low-rise, perhaps monotonous neighbourhood. The form, as seen on the right, helps define and create a sense of place, define urban spaces, but also they can adapt. And in this case, the intention was that we would split up the blocks between ourselves and DRMM and each interpret them differently so that they can take on a richer character and a variety in their architectural specificity. So a typical block plan looks like this. It's a dumbbell arrangement of, although it forms a perimeter block, it's actually 2 apartment blocks that grow to step out on the corners like a dumbbell in order to lend additional aspect to each apartment. So in the shallower plan, we have 3 apartments. In the corner block, we have dual aspect, albeit using the step to achieve that aspect. And then in the south, we have townhouses that afford light, in sunlight into the courtyard, and then a few apartments above townhouses to the north. And here you see the section. So the intention is that the ground floor is constantly active. It has front doors onto the street, either giving access to duplexes for family housing, or in some cases, this might be a commercial space, and it might take some of the footprint of the car park behind. And then to the south, the townhouses that allow sunlight to enter the podium garden within, responding to the local urban condition. But it's really important that there are certain rules and simple rules that you can follow in housing to make a good place. Things like active streets, front doors onto the street, so that there's a level of security, natural security and surveillance of the public realm. And often, although I'm not going to talk about it this evening, when we've been retrofitting modernist estates, one of the things they constantly got wrong was the relationship to the ground, often putting car parking across the entire ground floor, elevating pedestrians up to a podium level or walkway level. And often when we're trying to retrofit those estates, we're trying to change the ground floor condition and then refurbish what's above. So the connection between outdoors and indoors is both considered at an urban scale, but also between the room, the terrace, and the space beyond. The plan that I've just shown you takes its cue from Alvar Aalto's Klopstockstrasse in Hansa-Viertel in Berlin, which here you see, when seen from the west, looks like an extended linear block, but from the east, it appears as 2 solitary buildings linked by a narrow central part here. So shallower blocks in the middle and then bulging out around the central core. And again, stepping to achieve, so I can't quite see it from this angle, but the sort of steps in the building line allow both direct views out to the west, but also views to the south. It's a way of marrying up the density, the efficiency that we need to design to, especially around shared circulation space, whilst allowing a level of personality, specificity, and thinking about the individual within the wider collective. And it's a model that we developed further at Sugar House Island in East London, down in Stratford. And whilst it's part of a wider master plan of 1,500 homes, and we worked again with the client on the common DNA that would inform all the projects, all the buildings, with us then developing 2 of the plots. Other architects were then able to take on those sort of set of rules, a set of principles to develop the additional blocks. So this one I'm just showing shows a mews in the middle, a perimeter block around the edge, but then also using a tower to provide local moments to help wayfinding, navigation around the neighbourhood, but also adding areas of local distinction. Creating an intensity in some of these spaces because of the sort of tight urban streets or rooms that we're creating, but also a sort of level of sort of more humane, more comfortable kind of scale within the muses. So the blocks here are as shallow as possible. I'm going to just move around to point out a few things. So a perimeter block is here. So this comprises 2 perimeter blocks plus a linear block on the riverfront. And the perimeter block comprises the mews that I've just shown you. They're very shallow, just 5 meters deep, but very wide houses. It allows us to create a very close, I think, 9 meter wide mews. Typically, highways would be pushing you to do more like 10 or more like 15, possibly up to 20. But the intimacy of a street that you've just seen in the last photos was really important. And likewise here. The tower steps forward to define and enclose this space. So again, it feels more like an urban room than a typical street laid out to highway standards. Typical apartments are flats either side of a core, each core with a lift. I mean, you wouldn't get any UK developer promoting this sort of approach of just pairs of flats around a core. They would typically want at least 8 flats off a single core. But here the client was very aware of the benefits that this achieves. Very shallow through aspect flats where you get good sunlight and daylight, but also it allows that intensity. It's a trade-off between the tight streets and the generosity of the apartments. And then within the donut, within the perimeter block, a secure residential garden, which creates something very different in terms of its character. Here, the landscape softens, the hard paved public spaces are replaced by verdant green landscape spaces, and the homes open directly onto this. No defined gardens or boundaries that separate neighbours from each other. This is very much a space for congregation and for sharing. Brentford Lock follows some similar ideas, but again, it's an evolution, an adaptation of a similar model. It's a perimeter block, but it comprises a series of villas. And here you see 2 of the villas facing onto the canal. The villas are locked or interlocked or connected by a shallower block here, comprising apartments and a very generous atrium in the middle. Loggia balconies add depth to the facade, which both helps privacy for the homes within. It provides thermal comfort by way of shading. So it becomes a climate moderator, but it also adds decorum to the public spaces and a level of civility that often you don't see in speculative housing, and a level of generosity as well. So here the plan, you can see the block I was just talking about was this. Below here, these 2 apartments is a large atrium where you can actually see right from here. In fact, below this, there's a double height space as well. So from this street, you actually get a view all the way through to the canal. Or if you're here, you can see through to the canal and then into the garden space. So unlike the last project, the garden is open and visible. It's secure for the residents only. There's a gate here. But you get that aspect, a bit like when you walk through London, you see the Georgian squares. They're not closed off in the way that a sort of mansion block might be. Georgian Square, you see over the garden wall and see the garden within. And then the main perimeter block is formed by these 4 pavilions or villas, connected in the case of here by townhouses and in here a linking apartment block. So a different typology. I think you could say this is more of a series of villas and townhouses, but nonetheless it forms the perimeter block that we know works and is a successful urban type. And always underpinned by a goal to deliver really sort of generous public spaces, shared spaces, as well as apartments. So here, the generous 2-story lobby is brick paved to extend that idea of continuity from the threshold outside into the lobby and beyond. Double height space, bricked to give it that sort of robustness, but also that feeling of transition between the outdoors to the in. And then the apartments on the top floor have these kind of wonderful vaulted roof lights as a way of adding spatial richness to the apartments and generosity. White City that we're working on at the moment in Hammersmith and Fulham sort of breaks the perimeter block even further. In fact, I'm not even sure you'd call it a perimeter block. It's a series of linear blocks, 6 of them alongside a community centre and a nursery. And there's a subtle cranking of the blocks here and here to suggest an enclosure of open space, but there's freedom to move continuously through these areas, a bit like the post-war, sorry, not post-war, this is 1930s, I believe, housing in the wider area. Again, these kind of thin linear blocks that allow kind of permeability and long views through the neighbourhood. But here, although these are repeated volumes, by flipping them, by mirroring them, again, it adds richness and complexity. And behind often those sort of plans that we're developing are considerations between the trade-offs that you need to make when planning good housing. Form factor is something that we're continually trying to improve upon. It's the relationship between the external surface and the internal floor. It's what gives a building its overall energy efficiency. The lower the form factor, the better a building performance. But this needs to be judged against the aspirations or considerations in terms of quality of internal space. So in terms of form factor, the most efficient is a double-loaded corridor here. But we know that then compromises the dual aspect qualities of an apartment, the character and feeling of this, the shared circulation becomes uncomfortable, sometimes mean. So the White City block on the far right here is a sort of what we feel is an optimized version of somewhere between a gallery access block, a double-loaded corridor block, and something further. So it achieves good form factor while also delivering a comfortable dual aspect by cranking and adding additional aspect by these kind of folded forms. So always trying to test and measure the performance of our buildings is really critical. It's a scheme that's currently in planning. These are just some of the views of it. But you can see the dynamic that you get and the character of the street spaces that is achieved by simply cranking and mirroring those built forms. And the fact that you get those kind of long views, but characterful views, rather than just parallel linear blocks, which would feel soulless. Your view is framed and terminated by the cranks in the buildings.
So the ground floor private space?
The ground floor has private space, for the ground floor flats. They're largely duplexes, so they have their privacy for bedrooms off the street. But those flats open onto shared space. And that is not a common condition, I appreciate, in London, but it is actually characterful of this area, and it works well in the area, as you've seen from the figure ground plan earlier. So it's something that has been supported by both the community as well as planners. It was a very heavily co-designed project, this, with the local residents. And here you just see that variety and the urban ensemble of the different blocks and the sort of variety and character that's achieved from buildings that have that common plan. Okay, I'm going to speed up. Next section is about grafting. And often we're adding buildings to existing buildings. And grafting is a horticultural term whereby tissues of plants are joined so as to continue their growth, helping build resilience for the plants, help them grow stronger and increase yields. And intensifying our cities is very much like grafting. New buildings help regenerating an area, overcome some of the area's urban failings and providing much needed new housing. So just up the road from where we are now is Regent's Park Estate, and I think this was mentioned in the crits today, I believe. And we've been working with Camden, adding 100 homes to replace homes that were lost because of HS2 construction. But importantly, we wanted to keep those residents within their neighbourhood and the community that they're familiar with. So we found some leftover or underused sites to add in a total addition of 8 blocks, but I'll just touch on 3 here and here. And what's quite telling about this plan is almost you can't notice them. They become part of the continuity of Frederick Gibbard's master plan, which in itself had quite baggy character and morphology. If you go around the neighbourhood, actually there's a lot of capacity. In fact, there's a lot of capacity across London for intensive infill. So the first block is Kirkfell on Robert Street. It's a simple rectangular form that adds continuity to the street. This was a car park that was underused, and you can imagine it was kind of felt like leftover space. The building adds continuity, but also opens up a new public square designed by East and a new connection north to south. A community centre at the ground affords us the opportunity to add generosity through the form of a piano nobile into the first floor apartment. In fact, this is a duplex, so these are 2 duplexes on top of each other. But a simple goal that just adds an extra generosity, extra quality to those apartments. A continuous gallery of balconies or continuous balconies on the south side, mirror and echo Armstrong and McManus's work opposite. But it also kind of wraps around the gable, and often gables are all inconsidered and blank, whereas here the gable adds a sense of decorum and civility to the new public square here. Internally, it's a very simple series of stacked maisonettes. You have a bit like the city, walkway acting as that street for social connection, generosity as you come into the lobby, opening onto the kitchen, steps to allow more generous living space down here, and then the cranked form of the party wall allows us to deliver well-planned and sensibly arranged bedrooms while sticking within strict cost parameters as well as spatial parameters. And here you see the walkway acting as that space of local interaction and connection, and the balcony adding that continuity from indoors to out. Kentmere, the second project here, forms the corner of a perimeter block on Redhill Street. Simple rectangular volume cranks back to address certain site conditions that you'll see in the next slide. Balconies are doubled up to give it a sense of urban scale, but also genuinely feel like outdoor rooms. And here you see the plan cranking, both completing the block, but also adding a generous threshold for the entrance, but also using that step to mediate between the scale of the lower Victorian buildings to the north. Cowdale, the third in the trilogy, is a bookend apartment building next to a short terrace of family houses. The step in height allows light and sunlight into the apartments behind that you can see, and the generous 2-storey gateway here provides a route through to a local play space beyond. Again, the sort of games we're playing in terms of composition help lend generosity and scale that often you don't see in housing, which too often consists of just stacked apartments and repetition. And internally, the apartments, just to pull out one feature, are set up as an enfilade of rooms, the kitchen diner space opening and connecting to the living space, extending to the outdoor balcony in the form of a room. And immediately, even working within very tight space standards, this is low-cost social housing. It has a sense of generosity and sense of connectivity and light through the depth of the plan. And it's an idea that we take from the work of Neve Brown and the brilliant work around Camden from the period of the 60s and 70s. Here, an illustration from one of our students, a model they produced at London Met, showing how he planned the interior spaces as a sort of and the external terrace as a series of 3 equally proportioned rooms that are connected enfilade. Okay, the last chapter is about the home. Moving to the cellular structure. And Louis Kahn's expression, a family of rooms, seems pertinent here. Lawrence, in his introduction, talked about some of our wider work influencing the sort of conditions that shape housing. And I wanted to just touch on that before I go into the home. Housing is highly regulated, but architects have a role to play here, and we have agency beyond what we design. Through policy work, through demonstration projects, through engagement with civil society, we can help shape the broader conditions that influence how our cities and our buildings evolve. It's why we've actively sought out those opportunities to influence central government, work with local government, and in this case, working with the Mayor of London on his new housing design guidance, and more recently on the London Housing SPG. It allows us to have agency and influence over the things that we often feel unempowered over. But there's a danger that standards become a set of constrictions rather than opportunity, and I need to be very mindful of that. Standards during the 20th century were prioritizing functionality, anthropometrics, ergonomics, and safety. Some might argue squeezing out the life and space for conviviality. Christine Frederick's book, Household Engineering, Scientific Management in the Home, was published in 1919, was very much a proponent of efficiency in the home. And then Lillian Gilbreth's work extended that into motion studies, looking at how to increase efficiencies, here in the case of the kitchen. And it's become the foundation for much guidance, including later Parker Morris on the right, who published his seminal Homes for Today and Tomorrow, published in 1961. And it set for the first time minimum space standards, often based on utility. So we need to be conscious about not being too deterministic when writing policy, balancing standards and metrics with qualitative considerations. The London Housing Design Guide draws on centuries of accumulated knowledge about what makes good housing. It sets new standards for light, for space, but also sustainability in places. But it recognises certain patterns, the relationship between public and private space, the importance of aspect and orientation, the need for flexibility, and a basic spatial provision persist in what we need of in a home. And often architects blame such systems for spatial impoverishment. But I would argue that actually it's the market and the pursuit of profit in much housing that has compromised and impoverished housing. The Mayor's design standards are intended to be a safety net, ensuring a basic quality of life for everyone, recognising that a decent shelter is an unassailable human right. Now, when we were writing this, we were also developing designs for the Agar Grove estate, also for Camden, developed in collaboration with Hawkins Brown. And so it became an opportunity for us to test the standards that we were writing for government and really perhaps test and prove that they weren't a constriction on creativity. The project's a 1960s estate where the residents had deemed it unfit for inhabitation. So there was agreement through resident-led initiative to redevelop, albeit the residents of the tower wanted that kept. So that's going to undergo a deep retrofit, stripped back to its frame and refurbished. But the low-rise houses that you can see that have very little relationship to the public realm, have below Parker Morris space standards, have very compromised internal space and poor quality of built fabric, were deemed unsuitable or unable to be saved. So they're being demolished. And you can also see that the urbanism of the previous state had very little relationship to the wider neighbourhood. The Victorian villas that marched down one side of Agar Grove are ignored by the fences and blank gables on the other side. So the master plan is very much about being good neighbours. It's not about abstract geometry. It's about responding to the patterns of daily life, solar orientation, and the need for social connections, extending the network of streets through the wider neighbourhood, but also addressing the demand of the client to design to passive house standards, which I'll come on to. I'll just illustrate one of the blocks. This was phase 2 that's just been completed, but by us, and Hawkins Brown have designed other buildings. But it comprises 2 mansion blocks at either end, plus a sort of terrace of houses and duplexes, really a panoply of types that respond to the character of the wider area. It forms an urban composition, framing streets, framing a new green space here, but also a centralised community garden for the exclusive use of these residents, compared with the more accessible, wider public garden for everyone. And it deals with that sort of mid-scale and density that we need more of to make use of efficient land. Here along Agar Grove, the villas, so we call them, sort of mirror the proportions and scale of the Victorian villas opposite, adding that cultural continuity. Streets with homes on front doors help engage residents with the street environment, allowing them to become stewards of both the community and the ecology. Stewards. The sort of public realm is then set back, or the houses set back between a sort of fast flow of pedestrian traffic here, a more pedestrian or resident flow of traffic here, and then softer landscape that gives a buffer and a living street to these developments. Although it looks like a grand villa, it's actually split up internally. It's a triplex above a duplex. The duplex at ground is entered off the street. I can't see from this angle. And connects to the garden beyond with 4 bedrooms above. The duplex above is entered off a walkway into the middle, and you either go down to bedrooms, so bedrooms are stacked on top of bedrooms, or you go up to a living space above. And internally, you get, again, a sense of connection between different rooms through the glazing, but also to the outside. We can think of some of the Delft painters, perhaps, of Pieter de Hooch, or Emmanuel de Witt, and others who kind of captured that idea of connected spaces and thresholds between public and private. And even the outdoor space becomes a part of a cellular structure, forming an outdoor room, connecting that space, but with low boundary treatment. So there's an immediate connection to the communal garden beyond, which becomes a space for sharing and encounter. The next block is a series of duplexes above duplexes, again, not pretending to look like stacked duplexes, but wanting to look like townhouses. So that they feel they have a sort of sense of civic scale. And again, here you see in the plans in the section, duplexes here, kitchens sitting in the middle with dining space and living space on one side, again, with the flexibility to close them off or open them up. So there's sort of enfilade, but again, flexibility if you want privacy at this end of the house or that end. And then the duplex above has its amenity in the form of a very deep, wide inset balcony, which again makes it feel more like a room and lends it privacy. And here you see those connected living spaces with their pocket doors, but also trying to get light into the top of a stairwell. This is simple but low cost, affordable housing made to feel as generous as possible. And then the mansion blocks bookend the scheme, and they have a very different typology. Here it's alluded to in the gable. It gives away the idea that there's something more complex going on in this building. And they're a set of duplex apartments. These ones sitting within a simple orthogonal form. At the other, the additional story that adds height at this end of the block is more crenellated and more expressive at the top. And here, talking through the section, building on, again, amazing work done by Sidney Cook in the 60s and 70s with architects like Neve Brown, Peter Tabori, Benson and Forsyth, developing interesting typologies in terms of split level. So here you have an apartment on the ground floor, and then you have split levels. The beauty of these is that you can give a real spatial richness to something that's working within very tight parameters and tight space standards. So here you come in at this level to your kitchen diner, and then you either go down to the bedroom, have I got that the right way around? No, sorry, down to the living room or up to the bedroom, or in this case, this is obviously the inverse, so you can see that they're sort of like that. But the beauty of these is as you come in, you get those long views either up towards the sky or down to the ground. And again, there's a sort of sense of connectivity to the city beyond. This perhaps gives a better sense, this model, a better sense of the character. So flats are all accessed off the walkway that happens. And then every other walkway is a fire escape, so not typically inhabited. So bedrooms have their privacy. And here you get a sense of the quality and character of those spaces and the generosity of them. And human habitat, in the deepest sense, is much more than just shelter. It's a fulfillment and the search in space for happiness and emotional equilibrium. And this is really trying to create the delight that improves our quality of life and sense of well-being. The kitchens, as I mentioned, sit at the back and overlook the walkway. And talking to residents, they feel that connection. It's short walkways. You're only at most passing 2 other flats, and they become a space for conversation and connection. And the passive house performance is dealt with through an efficient envelope, highly insulated, but also naturally ventilated, allowing through flow of air, photovoltaics and a green roof, solar shading, again informed by the inset balconies or the walkways, as well as ground source heat pumps. So often passive house is assumed that you can't achieve richness and complexity, but in actual fact, we've kind of experienced here and shown that actually you can achieve passive house while creating kind of wonderfully rich homes. So I mentioned some of Camden's modernist projects, but actually also a source of inspiration for this and some of the best split-level apartments we've observed are in works of the likes of Darbon and Dark here at Lillington Gardens in Pimlico, but also you could think of Kate Mackintosh's work at Dawson's Height. There was a confidence and an ambition in this period work that we really admire. It had an idealism, a sort of idea about a better state, delivering better housing for the working class, but also, I think, common to architects like Darbon and Dark and Neve Brown was an interest in creating sort of low-rise, high-density, and that's something that we've sought to build on. So this brings me to the end of my talk. I would love to share some of our community and cultural projects as well, and sort of those we need to recognise in urban planning are really also the foundations of a successful sense of community. They provide access to those that infrastructure that we need. But I haven't got time to touch on those, maybe another talk. So I'll save that for another day. But just to conclude, the spatial systems for society that I've talked about sit between organic growth, between efficiency and adaptation. They sit between order and the organic, between human and natural systems. I've sought to define a new kind of urbanism that is both technical, but also deeply ecological, and both socially engaged and environmentally regenerative. The living system is not just a metaphor, but a model for action, a way of thinking about how we create places that truly sustain and enhance life. So I'm just going to finish by unashamedly plugging a book that we've recently published that tries to put some of these ideas and reflections from 24 years in practice towards a resilient architecture. It's a deliberate riff on Le Corbusier's perhaps more eponymous work. But it puts in to writing some of the interconnected thinkings between the social, sustainable and spatial principles within our work. Thank you very much.
Alex, thank you very much. That was absolutely wonderful. And we have a bit of time for questions. If I could invite those in the audience to offer them. While you're thinking about your questions, I'm sure there will be many. One of the things that interested me a lot was throughout your your presentation, you mentioned terms like association, stewardship, community. And in a way, at the end, you said, we need a supplement. You know, the supplement, in a sense, is the community provision. And there's a kind of interesting tension where, on the one hand, you're accepting that a lot of what we have to do is provide housing, as though it's residents awaiting provision on the basis that there is a need, a right. And on the other hand, there's this sense that they're active, that they're doing things, that they become a subject, and a subject that is important to the life of the city. And so much of what you were saying was kind of accepting the standards, the language of that sort of notion of need. And yet underlying it all is this idea that there's really something more. Now, don't we have to build that right into the floor plans of the housing? Or can we keep on relying upon the supplement, something outside?
I think in terms of the social infrastructure, or in terms of the way people need to be able to adapt and change to their lifestyles. If I pick up the first one in terms of a wider social infrastructure, I suppose it was sort of limited in terms of time to I mean, that could be a whole nother lecture about the sort of mixed-use projects. Housing is 70% of the city, and it's the background of everything. So I wanted to sort of prioritise that. But I guess we need to recognise that even within housing, architects need to be able to step back and hand over our ideas, our schemes, and let life take over. Now, some, R.V. Friedman talks more about flexibility in terms of adaptable structures. But actually, if you create more diverse places, that allows a degree of flexibility. Social mobility is a form of flexibility. So if you offer a diversity of house types, affordability, it allows people to kind of progress or change as they need to. The home itself, I think, flexibility for me is just some simple ideas in terms of the ability to close it off for privacy, open it up for connectivity. Not necessarily seeking to introduce more explicit ideas around, the Rogers idea of expressed flexibility. I think it can be implied through creating simple, robust architecture that's generous and allows people to inhabit it in the way that they see fit. Does that answer?
I think it's an ongoing discussion. Something that we're interested in the program is the idea of greater extension within the floor plan to encourage the incorporation, as you say, of mixed function environments, but also just beginning to look at dwelling as itself a kind of associational practice, as opposed to something that splits the idea of the liberal household from a wider concern for social provision, where the two things remain largely separated. We're wondering, how we begin to use architecture to challenge that and start to ask the question, isn't there an associational logic to dwelling? And can we begin to rethink housing provision because you keep coming back to the real value being in something that is added by an active participant in the life of the setting, the community, the stewardship, as I say, and so on. So it's something that I would love to continue as a discussion, but I'd like
just to quickly expand on that point, though. There are a couple of other thoughts that play into that. One is, I didn't talk about the variety of tenures within the schemes, but that last one, the simple block itself, has social rent, London living rent, shared ownership, private ownership, all sharing that same garden. There is that social mobility, so inherent within the diversity of types offered. I think the other thought on that point, because is about the generosity you can create in terms of the shared spaces, because often we are designing to minimum space standards. They are cost driven. It is very hard to be more liberal in terms of extending the floor plate of a building, and I can come back to this in terms of the housing standards. But where you can kind of create more space for more flexibility is in those shared spaces. That's why galleries are kind of outdoor galleries are an interesting alternative to indoor corridors, because you can see that they're planted up. You can put a deck chair out. You can use it as an extension of your living room. It's somewhere you can connect and talk with neighbours and have a convivial conversation.
Yeah.
One of the biggest challenges we had in writing the housing design standards was a sort of recognition of how do you come up with a robust metric for the size of a home that isn't going to be challenged by commercial developers saying, but we can design them smaller.
Yeah.
So we needed a very robust system to show that these are the things you need within a home. So it had to be around occupancy numbers.
Yeah.
But that's not to say you can't under-occupy and live more generously in a bigger home that is designed for more people. So we had to base it on occupancy. We had to come up with sort of robust basis for determining a typical furniture, but also allowing space for activity, for movement, for the other sort of things that happen in a home.
Yeah. Catherine, you had a question.
So I'm going to take us to the other end of the scale, back to the city scale. And in the beginning, you talked about these kind of contained neighborhoods and of 25,000 thousand people, 1 kilometer square zones, and that there was a kind of walkability. And I guess at the risk of getting into a kind of green beltish conversation, I noticed that you'd also assign densities to those agglomerations. So how do they grow? Like, what happens if one becomes incredibly popular as a place to live? Is there kind of a scheme to allow intensification? Do you let it happen naturally? I'm assuming, like Silchester, that you might not be building a wall around the edge. So I guess I wondered, how do you deal with evolution and growth, or do you just say, sorry, this one's full, and another one has to? That's
kind of the intention, yeah. That actually, like the slime mold, it goes off and finds another area to colonise. So intention is it is geographically limited in order to ensure that there's good natural landscape or productive landscape around it. That's not to say there can't be, as any cities evolve, further intensification within the neighbourhood. But the intention is that it would the next zone, the next node.
So there is something like a green belt. There is a defined edge.
Yes.
There has to be. So you can't have that sprawl.
Yeah, but it's not as geometric as the so orthogonal the octagon. It would respond to the local place. Yeah, could be a city wall. I'd be quite interested in a new model for a city wall, inhabited.
I wanted to ask about mostly regeneration projects. So I'm thinking, obviously, the Ellesbury estate and how it can be approached in the office or yourself when there is a lot of controversies, a lot of like obscurity or questions in the process with public-private partnerships, and also like recent history in London, Highgate, like all those big debates that are happening. What is your stance? How do you approach it? And are there any like doubts or evolution while you design it?
Very good question. I think our means of engaging with that conversation are getting richer and more informed these days. With the Agar Grove estate, the client had already had the conversations with the residents before we were appointed in order to inform the brief. They had done the studies about whether retention, the options are either do nothing, retain and refurbish, or redevelop. And the basic, in that case, the basic principle had already been established with majority support from the residents. we're very uncomfortable, and we thankfully haven't been involved in projects where there isn't support from the residents within the estate that we're designing for. They see the benefits of new homes and the sort of improvements to their living environment. But then there's the other part of the equation, which is the carbon cost of demolition and redevelopment. And I think that's where we do need to develop better tools for measuring the carbon impact of demolition and replacement. We're trying to do that more, working with the likes of Useful Projects and other consultants. And we're currently looking at sort of developing a housing legacy toolkit for local authorities, because it's not just these sort of urban projects, but actually a lot of regional towns have sort of low-rise, sort of post-war housing, which has not been well maintained, is in poor condition, and feels unsafe because the urbanism just doesn't work. It's all Radburn layouts and the like. And so we're trying to develop a toolkit to kind of measure that those trade-offs between retrofit, replacement, and other options. But it's a difficult one, and it has to be done with the residents. We've always had the privilege on our commissions to work very closely with the residents who we're serving.
You'd like to follow up here? Yeah. George, do you have? No. Sorry, Steve.
Thanks. It's really maybe to help some of the students in housing and urbanism. One of the things that I'm sure you enjoy doing, and a lot of us as architects enjoy doing, is trying to design from the inside out. And I think there's always a pleasure to see some of the plans that you've done with the range of types of flat and tenure and so forth, that almost are a little bit effortless. And I think when you've got the challenges of an existing building, like your Hillingdon project, and also with low energy buildings and the seeking passive house, you've got to almost sort of understand the physicality of building and performance of building, as well as usable, workable, logical space from the inside out. I just wondered if you had any kind of anything to say on how you approach that can assist students with working with either existing housing or new housing.
So with existing housing where you're retrofitting, I suppose you sort of segregate the sort of bones of the building and the dispensable elements. So you need to sort of draw a series of plans that separate out what the sort of backbone is, the structure that's unmovable or costly to change and move, versus what can flex. So for example, at Hillingdon Square that you've just mentioned, that I apologise I haven't shown, but I mentioned that the ground floors were all garages. Now, looking at how the infrastructure around, we were able to extend those into the flats behind and actually extend and create more generous homes, but also then animate the street with new front doors. So I think trying to produce those drawings that disaggregate the sort of fixes and the more flexible elements is a good start. Think of buildings a bit like a sort of onion where you have kind of layers and layers, and there are things that are going to last 10, 30 years. There are things that are going to last 30, 50 years, and ideally the structure lasts indefinitely. And try and separate out those sort of three conditions. Because something like Agar Grove, the tower that I showed, we did a study to look at, okay, what is the lowest level of intervention? Can we refurbish this with residents in place? What would be needed? We'd have to upgrade the fabric for thermal performance. We'd have to upgrade all the heating and electrics. And once you try and unpick that from the plan, you realise it's just too invasive. There's no way residents can stay. But then you look at projects like Great Arthur House on the Golden Lane Estate. the city have done a brilliant job at refurbishing that with the residents in place. So it can be done on the right kind of buildings, but you need to understand the building. So through optioneering on that project, it became apparent that the only way to get the lifespan needed in the retrofit would be to strip it back to the frame, because anything else would have probably only lasted another 10 years. It extends a life not long enough to justify the investment.
I mean, the other thing that I was intrigued, and I'm looking forward to discussing it with some of the students, is, you know, these kind of really super thick building fabric on the new build, you know, to get the kind of robust details, and that changes the approach too, obviously. So it's nice to see that on the drawings, you know, big thick walls.
Yeah, I mean, we're designing typically I think Agar Grove was about 500 thick. Nadine, I can see at the back of a room will tell us. I think now we're designing 600 mil thick, but they become great because they provide space for a window seat or for shading. You can use that depth in quite an interesting way, but they also give a sort of sense of monumentality is perhaps the wrong word, but so weight and heft to the building that you can play with.
Alex, I'm kind of intrigued to see two design trajectories in your work. One that is very respectful of the traditional London street, and morphologies that are quite conservative in a good way. You know, we know what they provide us with, we know what they achieve, and it's kind of it's a safe trajectory, I would say, to keep on refining them and reworking them. On the other hand, you are clearly fascinated by the work of Neve Brown and his friends and colleagues who challenged those morphologies, who actually started by saying, well, we have to completely rethink them. Your work is fascinating. It doesn't seem to see any conflict between the two.
Well,
you marry them quite elegantly.
Very good. Sorry, finish.
The question is if you could elaborate on how you managed to bring those two together, and you seem to be quite relaxed about their marriage.
I think it's partly born out of necessity, partly born out of our design interests, but it relates to Steve's point, because they didn't worry about thermal bridges in Neve Brown's time. You know, to try and create an efficient, well-performing envelope, you want to try and create continuity in terms of envelope and simple form. And the beautiful thing, I mean, I love Alex. I used to live in the Barbican. I love Alexandra Road. You know, all those modernist schemes. They don't really care about concrete just carrying on from indoors to out, or step sections and providing a lot of thermal inefficiency above and below. So I love the exuberant, expressive character of that work. But there is a reality in terms of the difficulty of achieving that now. So I think it becomes a more interesting challenge, actually, of how do you create those spatial types within more simpler volumes. So that's in terms of a form. And then I suppose the second point of your observation is about the architectural expression. And I am a big admirer of neighbourhoods like this, where Georgian architects designed very simple terrace housing and town housing that had a sense of civility, decorum, well-proportioned facades and simple expression of materials that I think I'm very keen to embrace.
It's clear how much peace and how you don't seem to wish for a different morphological starting point as many others do, which gives you a lot of confidence and rigor in your work. You accept it and you try to challenge other things, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, whenever I think about the work of Neve Brown, I ask myself what could have happened if they have finished their urban project, not only the kind of project on the dwelling, but actually the urban project. I I doubt the street and Jane Jacobs' approach would have been quite as central as it is to your work. So it just fascinates me how those two.
I
come
think
together.
one aspect that has changed in terms of urban and architectural thinking since that period is a sort of recognition that successful places have a much greater degree of granularity in terms of their architectural expression. And so a lot of that work is repetition writ large. And even in a Georgian terrace, it has variety because it's often built by plot builders who borrow from a pattern book and have different fan lights above the windows, have different proportion of window. I mean, you see it even here. So actually there is local nuance and character. And I guess we're not working in an era where, and I don't know if this is driven by architects or clients, but actually where architects can exert that authority and consistency across all the buildings. If Agar Grove was just one architect, we would still design the buildings differently. I mean, we agreed with Hawkins Brown a sort of common DNA in terms of materials treatment and some of the language or approach, but there's a huge variety because that's what we see as making successful cities. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? In that case, Alex, thank you so much for your generosity and wonderful explication of the projects. Really, really beautiful. Thank you so much. Very valuable.